Please show your consent if you can. Welcome everyone, my name is Kiran Bhat and I am one of the event coordinators of the Golchakkar, which is an Indian literary journal focused on, different South Asian art from a different lens. I personally am very excited for this talk because we never really talk about the graphic novel, I think, in the context of South Asian literature. So I'm really excited to hear about it and learn about the different sorts of influences that have allowed for this beautiful hybrid form to exist. The lovely founder of the Golchakkar, Kiran Bhat, is here, and I'm sure he also has some lovely words for us. So I'll let him just say something real quick.
Thanks, Kiran. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Sharanya, for coming. Thank you, Varud. I just met you guys for the first time, I think. Devapriya, nice to see you again. I hope you're doing well. As Kiran said, we've been doing this Golchakkar event now for, I don't know, like almost a year, 8 or 9 months. And we're really excited for this graphic narratives event. So I'm just gonna let this go. Kiran, I'm passing this to you. You gotta lay it up and slam dunk this in. Go ahead.
Wonderful. So I would love to have everyone maybe give a short introduction. Me and Sharanya were talking a little earlier, and this title is not just because it's also about graphic novels, but because a lot of us exist in kind of unique interpretations of South Asianness as well. So it's going to be interesting to talk a little bit about our biographies and our identities and the different nations we straddle, as well as then how that impacts form somehow. So I don't know who I should ask to introduce themselves first. Maybe Devapriya. Yeah, why not you? Because you've not talked at all. So let's hear from you.
Muted,
Still
maybe?
not talking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Oh God, sorry. Today has been one of those crazy days where technology has failed me all morning and all afternoon. And now, well, okay. I can see you guys, I can hear you guys, so I suppose I won't jinx it now. Thank you, Kiran. Wonderful to be on this fabulous panel. About myself, I always get a little bit flummoxed when I'm asked this, I am a reader with a bit of a writing problem. When I wrote my first book, it was called The Vague Woman's Handbook. And many years later, when I read Doris Lessing's autobiography, in that she says that writers in their first book, mostly women writers, they define themselves in that first book, right? So I was defining myself as a vague woman. Now, I don't know if that was a very responsible thing to do, but it gave me a bit of leeway because as this vague person, I kind of, experimented with very different kinds of forms. So I've written novels, one of which, the newest one, was actually serialized, right? So I actually wrote it week by week, and that was a grand, if insane, experiment. I suppose, I remember Sharanya and I were talking about it, and Sharanya has a weekly column. So the whole thing was that writing it serially meant that it was always due, right? Other than that, so 3 novels and a book that I think sort of writing it was the most wrenching and difficult. It's called the Heat and Dust Project, and it's the story of a crazy journey around India on a very, very tight budget. So 500 rupees a day, and that was for the 2 of us. It was co-written with my husband, sort of. And for that book, truly, we didn't know when we started the journey what the eventual form of the book would be, right? We knew it would be part travel, part memoir. I don't know if Varud also sort of had a bit of that thing that, when it's such a journey and it's so searing, what ultimately gets into the narrative is something that only came together while writing it, sort of sentence by sentence. But the most sort of experimental book that I've done till date is Indira, is the graphic novel, the one that we're here to talk about today. And I must confess that I came to it sort of accidentally, or my friend and longtime editor, Kartika, she actually wanted to publish a graphic biography of Indira Gandhi for Mrs. Gandhi's centenary year, right? And for some reason, she thought that I should do it and Priya Kurian should do it. Priya and I had never met till then, right? So so as I keep saying that it was an arranged marriage, right? So she decided that Priya and I should work together, and she decided that we should write this graphic biography of Mrs. Gandhi. And then she told me, and I can never say no to her. So I read 3 or 4 biographies of Indira Gandhi and said, okay, I'm going to do this. It was really exciting. But for me, I was this wordy person, right? I'd written novels and narrative nonfiction. I had never worked with with images. So really, and I'm not an artist, I can't draw for the life of me. So for me, then it was about learning while doing, right? So Priya and I, so literally she was my teacher, and chapter by chapter, I'll talk more about it, when we chat about books. I learned to do this, and of course, it was really a great sort of experience at so many levels. Okay, I'll shut up now, guys. I think I've talked.
No, sorry, it was very fascinating. One second, I'm just going to mute some people to get rid of that echo. Yes, I also want to talk about the Heat and Dust project, because I think that also ties into a lot of interesting things that incidentally also will come up later, and also a lot of the aspects of that really interest me. But we'll get into it for a second. As we're doing introductions, Sharanya, do you want to now tell a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I've really been looking forward to this event. My journey as a writer began when I was a child, when I was 7 years old, like many people. And I've published 6 books so far in a number of different genres. I began as a poet, and then I began to write fiction, both short fiction as well as a novel. And then this year, I made my debut as a writer as well, with a children's picture book called Mermaids in the Moonlight. And this is actually my second picture book. I had written one which was published a few years back, called The Amuchi Puchi, which was illustrated by Narina Kanzi. And that was actually a really intriguing cross-cultural project, which relates to something we were talking about earlier before the event began, because an independent publishing company in the UK called Lantana Publishing has writers and illustrators from different cultures. So Narina is from Argentina and had no South Asian context at all, and it was a beautiful kind of collaboration. As for my becoming an illustrator, when Mermaids came out, many people asked me, when did you think of doing this? And I can tell you when I thought about both Mermaids in the Moonlight and its companion graphic novel, Incantations Over Water, which is why I'm here. But as for drawing and painting, that was something that I'd been doing since I was a teenager. I didn't think of it as something separate from my creative self, just an aspect which I didn't share publicly, and kept to myself and my friends, and occasionally social media, I think, but not in any serious capacity. Mermaids in the Moonlight and Incantations Over Water are linked projects, companion books, which are about the same subject matter, which is that in my maternal hometown of Batticaloa in Sri Lanka, on full moon nights, if you go into the lagoon and you dip a paddle into the water and hold the dry end to your ear, you can hear these mysterious sounds emerging from the water. And all over this town, the symbol of the mermaid is everywhere, but there is no folklore. So I wanted to find out why this was. And my findings are what resulted in these 2 books. The graphic novel was always my main focus, but then the picture book just took over creatively and even chronologically. And I have just completed the art for the graphic novel last week. So that is scheduled to come out later in the year. Mermaids has been out for a few months now.
That's wonderful as well. And I think it'll be also interesting to talk about that process of creating your own artwork for your own writing. Maybe we'll have a separate question for that later. Finally, Varud, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, like where you come from, what you do, and then your writing, typical, these things?
So when it comes to straddling cultures, I grew up in the States, and about 4 or 5 years back, I was working as a consultant. I did my undergraduate in finance. I was working at Deloitte doing strategy and operations, and I was like, this is not working out for me. So writing for me was actually a way of getting through a tough time. It was me journaling in my room. It was me digesting thoughts and getting through a lot of serious conversations. It was at that point, most people who know me know that Ratatouille is my absolute favorite movie ever. And there's a line like, you have to be fearless if you want to be great. You have to kind of like go out and explore. And I was very privileged that I was at a point in my time that I could jump ship and travel for a bit. And so my first avenue of writing actually became travel writing. I was going through different countries. I didn't want to go to culinary school, but I knew food had some like very big impact on my life. So I was like, I can work my way through different countries instead, pick up odd jobs here and there. So like bartending in Peru, teaching English at a culinary school in France, and then writing about these experiences. It was a long this journey. I ended up in Delhi. And Delhi to me, as someone who grew up in the States, was kind of like summer vacations. It wasn't a place that I really got to spend time, wasn't a place I got to understand. And I think the one dimensionality of the outsider coming in was really shattered really fast. So my first book was Bhagavan Ki Pakwan, which was a title that I still can't properly pronounce. It was an exploration of food and faith in India. And it was very much a reflection of the personal journey I was going on was, hey, hit with depression, I want to understand different faiths, but also food is one of the strongest narratives. Food is one of the strongest kind of ways that we are all tied together in this world, in my opinion. And so that book came out and it meant a lot to me. At that same time, I was living in Delhi and having that kind of perception of the world shattered is where Chotu came from. And Chotu is a lot of metaphors, but primarily is the idea that anyone small can make a difference in the world. And it was me telling myself that very much through the character of this monkey in Chandni Chowk during the time of the partition. It was me reminding myself that, yeah, okay, the world of politics might be grim right now. People doing things for clearly not the best intentions, but as a small individual, I need to grasp the small victories I can and do the small things I can as an individual, kind of make a difference. And I think Chotu was very much primarily that to me, but also a partition story that reflects upon kind of the modern day as well, living in India. Yeah.
You know what's fascinating? I feel like I could have a really wonderful one-on-one conversation with each of you because each of you inspiring very different questions in me. But I think at the same time, I think there is one mergence here, travel, which I think is something all three of you can relate to. And I think that I'd like to explore that a little bit. So how has travel ultimately led you to the idea that you wanted to write primarily in a graphic novel form? Was it travel that led you to the space? Was it some other influence? What is the mergence between travel and the graphic novel form for you? Varud, can you maybe start us off with that question?
Yeah, I don't think travel specifically led to the graphic novel. I should also mention, I don't draw. My artistic capability is zero. So the second half of the Chotu was Ayushi Rastogi, primarily my cousin, but also a brilliant artist. And so it was the story of our two grandfathers. But yeah, I don't think travel led to Chotu. Travel to me is a way of exploring cultures and people. And I'm sure as a well-traveled individual yourself, you understand that, especially growing up in a place like the US, you can feel bubbled, you can feel sheltered. And I think that holds true with every country you're in. It's easy to get sucked into the world around you. And so traveling is primarily a means of exploring different perspectives, different takes on life. And I think that's what inspired me as an individual to write, is just, there's a lot more out there in the world to see, experience, and obviously eat and taste.
So what then do you think led you towards the graphic novel form? Was it another particular path that made you decide I prefer this over any other form of art or narrative?
Yeah, I mean, just the fun of the visual medium. I've always read graphic novels as an individual. I usually always wanted to create the graphic novel. And for me, what you can do with the marriage of writing and illustration that you can't do in books was very enticing. To be able to bring to life a world is a very hard task. And Chotu is very much historical fiction. So we got to basically pour through archives and pictures and try bringing that world back to tell the story. And we also got to create really, I hope, cute characters along the way. And I think the fun of being able to explore what this medium could do in terms of telling the story and bringing it that moment to life is probably why graphic novels for me are such a fascinating space.
Sharanya, why don't we hear a little bit from you? Can you talk a little bit about the space where, you know, your travels or your positions in different places might have resulted in the work you came to write?
Yeah, for me, it was not travel as much as it was dislocation and exile. As a member of the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, a diaspora which has endured genocide and discrimination, leaving my, my homeland really as a child had a big impact on me. And then later on, I also left Malaysia, where I grew up, very, very traumatically. Got into trouble for some political writing I had done in my early 20s, and then wound up in India, where I hold citizenship, but where I had never lived, and wound up here as an adult. And so these experiences, which are quite different from travel or even from voluntary migrations, are really what have informed my work, but also myself, And I think with Incantations Over Water and Mermaids in the Moonlight, one of the things that's really important to how I created these works is I told myself, I'm going to Batticaloa to find out what happened to those mermaid stories. And with this desire, I embarked on something much, much more frightening, which was to find out whether or not I belonged to my native place. And the answers for that are beautiful and profound and painful and complicated, but these works are what allowed me to do it. By telling myself I'm doing research, I'm doing field work, I'm doing due diligence about the topic I want to write about and make art about, I found so much more, things which I will be not just creating from for the rest of my working life, but also things which have impacted me as a person, the way I see myself, the way in which I move in the world. And travel also does that, but certainly in my case, it was not really travel, except at the end when I had the privilege, because not everybody from the Tamil diaspora can go back. I had the privilege of being able to go several times over and to really create a meaningful relationship with the place, with people there, with my culture, with the land and with the lagoon.
It's such a fascinating topic of its own, the idea of returning as diaspora and choosing to live in India despite not being technically from India, which
I didn't choose, but let's not go there.
It's also, yes, related to that's its own topic as well. That's interesting. So for some of us, it was a choice. For others, it's related to issues of political status and all this. But Devapriya, I don't know if you would relate to any of that. So I feel like it'll have to be something for another conversation. But that being said, Devapriya, you did travel all over India, which is where I was going to try to tie this in. So how does...
Yes.
Yeah, tell us, yeah.
So two things. One, of course, that, our reasons for embarking on that insane journey was similar to Varud's, that, we were doing these things, but both Saurav and I, we wanted to write, and we didn't want to just write about the lives that we'd lived. We wanted to, move out of our comfort zones, travel, set ourselves free. And of course, we were traveling on a very, very small budget. The point of that was to actually, tether ourselves to the idea, of traveling, to see how the places would engage with us and transform us from within, right? So it's interesting that the Indira book, while doing the Indira book, there are two things. One is that we traveled for the book. So Priya and I, as I told you, that ours was an arranged marriage. So let's say our travels were the honeymoon. Okay, we got to know each other, and we also learned how to work together. So we went from Delhi to Allahabad because we wanted to actually see Anand Bhavan, where Indira Gandhi had grown up, and also spend some time in Allahabad trying to, interview people, trying to we spent a lot of time in the old parts of the city where before Motilal Nehru had built Anand Bhavan or moved to Anand Bhavan, before that they used to live in Chowk Meerganj, which was in sort of old Allahabad. So where might that have been, and so on. So we traveled for the book, and in many ways. So the thing about Indira is that Indira is a graphic narrative, but there's also a little novella that sort of interleaves the graphic chapters, right, Kiran? So the novella is about the writing of the graphic narrative, right? So there's that element of self-reflexivity in it. And the idea was also to provide a context because, graphic novels are usually not very voluminous, right? So we had a very strict page limit to work within that. Now, Mrs. Gandhi she had different stages of her life, each of which were very interesting. So we were sort of constrained a little bit, which is why the novella provided a framework. It was like a key to understanding how we approached the story, right? So much of that also came from the travels, right? So Allahabad features in both aspects of the book. So it's the Indira research, so that's Allahabad from 1917 to 1947 when they moved out from Allahabad, technically. But it's also about Allahabad now when the characters in the novella who are together sort of coming up with the graphic novel travel to Allahabad to do the research. So that was quite interesting.
And it also leads me to a good follow-up question, I think, that is valuable for all of you, because I think all of you are interested in historicity as well. Do you believe that there's a way that the graphic novels allows you to tell historical tales or spin historical narrative in a way that a traditional novel cannot? Is there a particular reason why you think this form is better for that type of storytelling over the quote-unquote traditional novel, other traditional forms? Devapriya, yeah, since you're already talking about it, please go ahead and carry on.
Well, Sharanya has written a historical novel, so she'd have greater insights. I haven't attempted one, though I must tell you.
Yeah, tell us.
I would definitely want to write one in the future. That's like on my list. But one of the things that was fabulous about doing the Indira story as a graphic novel was that we were able to bring in a lot of humor, right? We were able to use the graphic narrative to sort of connect to a younger audience. So we could be playful. So, there's that whole part where in 1971, when Mrs. Gandhi goes to the US, right, to meet Nixon. Nixon and Kissinger, of course, were quite anti-India, and now that we have the recordings, right, they use such unparliamentary language anyway. So what we could do was make it fun, right? So we had this Nixon character who is sort of having a meltdown, right? And he's saying, doesn't she know who I am? I'm the leader of the free world. And leader of the free world is something that American presidents on TV, on popular TV, you'll always have American presidents being referred to as the leader of the free world, right? So these are fun things that we could do, right? We could bring in that element of levity, because the thing is, Mrs. Gandhi is seen so much from the lens of the emergency or Operation Blue Star, right? The Iron Lady, that many of the other things about her life, little details. So, the fact that she took great pleasure in her saris. So when she went to a particular part of India, she took care to wear sort of a sari from there. So these little things we were able to weave into this, because the medium provided that kind of flexibility. But I would really be interested to hear how you guys approach this.
Yes, and it's an interesting point as well, because I also have this very solemn understanding of Indira Gandhi. So to imagine her three-dimensionally, that's a good point, that you can add a little bit more like a ha-ha-ha feeling in places that maybe in a traditional book it's hard because of the structure.
So, there's this funny story which, so Priya and I went back and forth. Sorry, guys, stop me if I'm just... So there's this story about when once Mrs. Gandhi was, she'd gone to Calcutta, there was a Congress meeting and so on, and Siddharth Shankar Ray was the chief minister then of Bengal. And this is before the emergency, when relations became bad between them and so on. So there, Siddharth Shankar Ray had planted a banana tree outside her window, because it went back to an old sort of childhood story that when Indira, she was very thin, right? Throughout her childhood, there's this thing in the letters. Her dad kept wanting her to become healthy. Okay, like all Indian parents, that, we eat well and become healthy. You're too thin. So she was very thin, right? And she was tiny. So she'd come, this is during when Motilal Nehru was Congress president. That year, the session had been in Calcutta. And interestingly, Netaji Subhash Bose had organized it. So all of this we could have fun with, right? And so Indira, so all the children were very excited to see Indira Nehru, because she's Nehru's daughter. She must be someone very impressive. So then they saw her and she was thin and she was tiny. And then they were like, this is Indira Nehru. And so she heard, what she did is dozen bananas, right? So then the story began to kind of get amplified, and everybody was like, do you know she must be very strong. She ate 12 bananas. No, she ate 18. So, stories of this sort, which in serious history might sort of get, forgotten, we were able to play around with this, right? Using the graphic media. I'm going to now shut up, okay?
Yes, thank you for sharing all that wonderful information. I think so. Let us now go to partition. Varud, how do you feel that you were able to craft a different type of partition story using the form of the graphic novel?
Yeah, I mean, I think Devapriya actually said it really well. What you are able to do is add humor, right? And for us, we used humor in this the sense of food. We use the humor in the sense of Bollywood tropes. And as a visual medium, you have your backgrounds, you have your environments to play with. And so sometimes that environment, your background is historically accurate, kind of like the clock tower that used to be in Chandni Chowk that no longer exists. And these are some details that you might not be able to kind of always fit into a plot. I'm working on my first historical fiction book right now, and you obviously want to cram in a lot of stuff about a time period to build the world, but that also might be sluggish for a reader. So I don't think the graphic novel is better for historical fiction. I think it lets you do different things, such as bringing that world. Another thing was relatability. When you have a like kind of microcosm, a little town of animal creatures, you obviously get to have fun with, again, the animal humor, but also we love animals, like off the bat as human beings. And so I remember sitting with Ayushi, and she had sketched every character. We loved each and every one except for Chotu. Chotu took us the longest time to get, because we knew he is the star, he is the pillar. He not only has to reflect the vibe, like we had to give him kind of like old school fashion sensibilities, we had to give him charm, we had to make him kind of young, but you had to off the bat just like, hey, I love Chotu, because you don't have that much space with the graphic novel. Again, as my panelists said, like you are working with the constraints of those panels and pages. So character development also happens in a very different form. You don't have the time to get to know your character. I think you kind of have to like the character off the bat. And so an artist, a visual imagination becomes so important for it. But when it comes to the partition, along the same thing is, for me, taking a serious moment in history and unpacking it with human relatability is what I like to do in my work. I don't want it to always be a solemn tale, and it is a very serious time, obviously, and there's no doubting that. But we don't get to discuss things if we treat things as Pandora's box, right? We can't sit around and have a discussion about a time period and the emotions and the feelings and perspectives that stem from that period if we come into it with a very serious attitude. And so hopefully using Parantas and Shah Rukh Khan movies from the 90s, it allows us to get into the partition, it allows you to relate with a character, but then also feel the emotions the character is going through during such a turbulent time.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and again, partition, even more so than Indira Gandhi, I always imagine in a very pessimistic light. So that's an interesting idea to give it a little bit of a masala spin. I also think
masala spin is the right word.
I also think that you made a very insightful point, which is that when we write a graphic novel, we can kind of, I don't want to say cheat, but there's certain little things we can do with pictures that allow for a reader to more quickly get closer to a character. Whereas, sometimes you spend 5 pages, and unfortunately, we live now in a time where people don't even want to read 5 pages if they're bored already. So it's interesting as well to talk about that part of the graphic novel. Sharanya, since you have experience with also writing between forms, maybe you can answer the question even more succinctly. So please let us know what you're thinking.
Devapriya mentioned elements of levity, which Varud also echoed. What I found when I was working on Mermaids in the Moonlight was that illustration allowed me to bring in gravity. So to introduce heavy topics like the Civil War to an audience of children, I was able to use the images while being extremely minimalistic with the writing, with the words. So that was an interesting interplay that I found in Mermaids in the Moonlight. I think with Incantations Over Water, I was thinking it through as we were having this discussion. I am not sure actually about I'm not sure about how I use that interplay between art and text for specific political things, but that could just be a short-term memory problem because I just finished the book. No, it's there actually. Now that I think about it, it's there. There are certain symbolic images which people who are familiar with Ilangai Tamil or Ilam Tamil issues will immediately recognize, but other people will not. So I was able to do that through the illustrations.
I almost was tempted to ask about the humor question, but I think it's also not harder, but I mean, from your perspective, given that you yourself have maybe dealt more personally with some of the history of the things you're dealing with, it might be harder to kind of have that critical distance to insert humor, but was humor a part of it?
Actually, yes, there is humor. But yeah, I think in just sort of tangential ways, like in the children's book, for example, there's a humorous sequence with a merman who wants to prepare food for a mermaid and a mercat, and everything, all the seafood in the sea is being carted off in a net because some human has carried it off, and the expressions on their faces are meant to be humorous. So in small ways, certainly, but I think I allowed for the gravity of the themes to remain what they were. I didn't try to inject more levity on purpose. I'm sorry.
No, you shouldn't be sorry. I mean, and it's understandable because it's different when you're like historicizing something that was from, say, 1947 or the 1970s, and then versus something that your family actually went through. So it's very different and understandable. Anyways, I do want to, however, change the topic before we start taking audience questions. The last question, I think, from my side for now is about the artwork. I mean, what's it like having to be an artist and trying to have to construct not only words, but also images for your words? Sharanya, would you like to tell us about that experience?
Oh, I absolutely loved it. I just, I loved it so much. And in Mermaids in the Moonlight, what I realized at the final edit stage was that the illustrator in me completely took over. She was like, these paragraphs don't need to be here, you know. And my editor and designer, they were very surprised, but that is something I discovered about myself creatively. For both books, I made sure that the text was ready first, because text is just easier to edit. But especially with incantations, you know, doing the art was it was very therapeutic, actually, more than anything else. And yeah, just a beautiful experience. I'm not sure when I will next get into an illustrated project, but I do know that I'm going to miss that aspect so very much. I think I was fortunate to be both writer and illustrator in a lot of ways, because then the conflict was something I could resolve myself. You know, with Narina Kanzi, whom I did the Amuchi Puchi with, there was no conflict. It was like she was in my head, you know, and I loved deferring to her as the artist, you know, out of mutual respect for our work. But this was interesting, the writer in me fighting with the illustrator in me, you know, and the illustrator usually winning was quite something to find out after decades and decades of thinking of myself primarily as a writer.
Wonderful. Devapriya, what was the process like for you?
So what we would do is, you know, when Priya and I met, we first try to understand how you know, how the artist works and how I was thinking of doing the book. But somehow I think, you know, the chemistry was right, because Kartika is very wise. So we just sort of got straight off the bat. What we did is, you know, I wrote the first chapter of the graphic part of the book, right? And I sent it to her. It was a long chapter. The book begins in 1966, on the day that Indira Gandhi is sort of going to, it's the day of the election, when the Congress president is going to be elected. And if she wins, then it means she's going to be prime minister or not. So Morarji Desai was contesting against her. And it's very interesting, because this moment in history, not merely Indian history, but also the history of women's movements, you know, at that time it was seen from that perspective. And Betty Friedan, for example, actually came to India to write about this, because to her at that time, that in the history of the women's movement, this was a true breakthrough moment, you know, Mrs. Gandhi becoming prime minister. So I was looking at all of those different testimonies, and then there was the chapter, and I tried to pack in as many visual details as I could, whatever's there, all the research, all of it. And then I sent it to Priya, and she turned it into panels. She didn't use any words, obviously. It was the first draft, right? She turned it into panels and sent it back to me. And I was just sort of stupefied, you know, what she could do, how that story could be told without the use of words. So I can totally see why Sharanya, the illustrator, was winning, you know, with Sharanya, the writer, because after that, I totally allowed Priya to, you know, to sort of take point on this, because a visual narrative works at so many different ways. And in so many ways, it's also more democratic, right? Anyone can access a visual narrative, right? You're not only, because otherwise when we write books in English, we are essentially talking to few people, right, in India. But with images, it just opens up. You also talk to children so much more easily. So, you know, one of the things that I say, that for this partnership, I am the uncool partner, right? So Priya can just talk to a room full of kids and do this little sketch, and they'll be eating out of her palms, and I'll be like trying to tell them a story, right? So it was a very great learning experience for me, really, you know. And Priya and I are very excited. We hope we're going to do something else in the future, collaborate again. Yeah. So I learned a great deal.
Varud, what was the collaboration process like for you between artistry and narrative?
Yeah, it's really funny. We had a very similar experience. Usually for like talks and presentations, I would take a more dominant form compared to Ayushi, because I think this was Ayushi's first time actually kind of, doing festivals and talks and being in front of a public audience. But when we went to the Partition Museum to do a talk for little kids, for like school kids, I sat on the side the entire time because Ayushi had a whiteboard and she had a marker. And there's nothing I could possibly do in that hour that would be cooler than Ayushi with a marker and a board and just like time to draw. But absolutely, I think the fun part is bringing that world to life. When we had pitched the book, I'd actually taken the stance of, it's probably best for me to write a script. So we'll have all the information there and then I'll give you the script and then you'll draw it. And we tried that out and it failed quite miserably for us. And I think in a place like a DC Marvel, where you kind of like have a high churn rate, right? You have to have like script to team to execute, and you have to kind of get it out there. That might work. For us, we're like, hey, we are actually in the same city. We can work in the same physical space. So me and Ayushi sat down and we paneled and drew out together every single page of Chotu before it actually went through. This was great in some aspects because it was kind of like that mind meld happening live in person. And me and Ayushi, we developed a visual language together that no one else in the world will understand. It's chicken scratch. It's me drawing stick figures, but as someone who can't draw, Ayushi was able to understand those figures, and then she'd send back more rounded stick figures, and I'd still be able to understand it. I think it was great because being able to kind of meld those two minds is probably the closest we'll ever get to what Sharanya is able to do and actually have both the aspects of an illustrator and a writer. It also was terrible on some aspects because once it's visual, once it's there on paper, it's harder to break apart. It's harder to make changes. So once we had kind of scripted out the entire book, we're like, oh no, some of these pages aren't working. And making changes to Chotu over the course of time was tedious. I probably broke down. I know I broke Ayushi down at the end of the process of putting this graphic novel together. Because I mean, the illustrator, I think, has the hardest amount of work to execute and put. And especially for a first timer, I know Ayushi would say, like, be sure this is what you want to do before jumping into a graphic novel, before putting it out there. But yeah, I just think that kind of relationship that you can develop working on a medium like this is also a lot of fun to be able to do.
Do we have any questions from the audience? We've got about like 10 minutes left. Does anyone in the audience want to say anything? Comments are also valid. Yes, Varud, go ahead.
Cool. This was Sharanya, you brought this up and I immediately wanted to intervene, but I'm not the moderator here and I didn't want to take away from Kiran's job. You talked about returning, you talked about belonging. And I'd love to, you hinted at, you'd come through some profound breakthroughs. And I think this idea of returning to, you might or might not belong, I would love to know that exploration that you went through.
For a second, because I was even thinking I was going to wait till after, because I didn't realize we had someone also Sri Lankan Malaysian mix here. So I was like thinking maybe after I was going to ask both of you. I have another space called Sambhashana, which is for South Asian diaspora. So I was thinking maybe we could have a follow-up conversation about specifically that angle when it comes to graphic novels and just talk about that. But if you want to talk about the here, it's fine too. But I was just thinking maybe we could very particularly have that conversation in another space. But anyways.
Thank you for asking. I think for the sake of participants who may have to leave, I'll answer very quickly. Because the answer really is, I could go on and on and on, so I'll try not to. But I think what it really is that the returning is very subjective and completely impacted by all kinds of external and internal circumstances. I know people who've made the journey that I've made and it has completely broken them. I know people who refuse to make it at all because they know it will break them. I know people who have crystallized an idea of what they believe in on all levels, including politically, and they know that going back will change that, so they can't. And I think for me, it was just I needed it, and I had to. I had to, and I knew it was a risk. But what I discovered about about the place where I come from was so different from anything which I had read about, but which tallied perfectly with a lot of things that I had heard about or felt. And this made me realize that I have a duty, to create artifacts in the form of books, or, well, my medium is books, right? That I have a duty to do this. And it's something that I took very, very seriously. And there are things about my work which are indulgently personal, but there are also many other things which are really just offerings to my ancestors, to the unnamed, to the disappeared, to all the silences and all the erasures. And yeah, I could go on and on and on. But there is another thing which I realized I had missed mentioning when we talked about bringing visuals in. One of the things I was able to do was to bring in a lot of Tamil, which you do not need to read in order to follow the flow of the storyline. So these are just for people who have access to the language. So then there's an added layer in the art, mostly ancient Tamil poetry by women, which appears in the book, and which I had to hand letter because I couldn't find a font in my very poor Tamil handwriting. But yeah, so that was also an experience. And thank you again, Varud, for asking this thoughtful question.
Anju is also asking a question. It's about the marriage of visual and words. Are they often like in a harmonious relationship, or do they end in divorce, as she said? Does anyone want to take that question? Talk about kind of the times when maybe visual language and like language don't necessarily work well together?
I have a little funny story to say, and then Varud and Sharanya can give the serious answer. Okay, so when we were finishing the book, it was insane because we also wanted to bring the book out in time for Mrs. Gandhi's birth anniversary. We failed to. All of that happened. So Priya and I would actually go to the office, right, to the Westland office to work in, carrying. So Priya would be carrying her huge pages and all of that, and with all our paraphernalia, and we'd go in together in the morning and work through the day on the final edits and so on. So Vishwajyoti Ghosh, who's a graphic novelist himself, Vishwajyoti was at that time, he was the art director at Westland, and every day he would make the same comment: I have never seen writers and illustrators getting along this way. You guys should be fighting. Okay, what is all this? You are constantly agreeing with each other and deferring to the other. So that was the thing. We disappointed Anju. We disappointed Vishwajyoti by not divorcing, apparently.
Varud, you sounded also like you were about to tell us a story. Could you kind of go into what you were about to say?
I think it's the flip side. Like, especially because me and Ayushi had a relationship before going into the book as cousins. It was really funny because like we would obviously tiptoe around a lot of things in the beginning. But when you get into the meat of it, you're in there. You have to get this book out. You have to finish those pages. And so I think there were lots of pages that were the result of divorce. And so like there's some pages that, the minds came together and you love. And then there's some pages where you're playing the game of like, okay, I will concede on this page. You do it your way. Maybe I can pick it up on a page afterwards and add different tidbits. But I think also the thing about writing a script and then giving it was like, words aren't as absolute as a visual. A word like building can be defined in so many ways. And as a writer, I think I had to balance the being specific versus vague about a word. Like, there's some points where the building is important, where I had to define like, hey, this building needs to look like this, versus there's sometimes where the building doesn't necessarily need to be a central character. And so I think balancing the words that are offered to a writer is also a very interesting dynamic.
Do we have either Sharanya, do you have a story related to this, or does someone else want to ask a question? Oh yeah, Sharanya, go ahead.
No, I have nothing to add. As the writer and illustrator, I had a harmonious marriage with myself. So.
Sometimes you're lucky. I don't know how many of us really have a harmonious relationship with ourselves. Any other questions? Does anyone here want?
Can you show us, Kiran? Can you show us some of the novels, some pics or something?
Oh, I'll have to probably share screen and go onto Google or something, because I don't have any of the books here.
Okay.
That being said, I'm sure here maybe some of you will have books of yours that you can kind of show to the audience and kind of do a little self promotion for a second. Yes, Devapriya is ready. I am good. Look, that's Indira from Westland. If she's talking about Kartika, yes. So yes, yeah. Why don't you show us? Yeah, more of the pictures. Can you put it a little closer? Yeah, and maybe yeah. Oh, those are very nice. Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
I can't see the pictures they're showing.
Yeah, maybe if you could unmute yourself, and then for the sake of making yourself bigger, you can just kind of say a random.
So some pictures, where are they?
Yeah, say something.
This is sort of one of my favorite chapters, and this is the Allahabad, section of the book, really. And this, for example, is the Jallianwala Bagh, the horrific incident there. So this is in, I'm sorry, I'm kind of either holding it too close. I'm terrible with this. I can never hold a book to screen, apparently. But I hope you'll take a look at all our graphic books.
Kind of getting to the point of wrapping up, this is a good time to do the typical telling us where to find your books, where to find you on social media, maybe some self-promotion of some sort, so please go ahead and feel free to tell us how to engage with you more. Anyone?
I mean, I think everyone, books are on Amazon. Please pick them up. But if you're in India, support your local bookstores, especially after the past 2 years. Almost every bookstore in India is doing a great job of taking orders and even delivering right to your place. In Delhi, Midland, and Bari Sons are doing a great job. So please support them. And I mean, my name, Varud Gupta, if you do want to see pictures of me eating instant ramen on Instagram. Yeah.
What about you, Sharanya? Yes.
Yeah, exactly what Varud said. Please support your local bookstores if possible. And if you are abroad and can't source any of our books, you can ask bookstores to bring them in on consignment. They'll do that on special order so that you do not have to buy online. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. Yeah, and I would love to show you Mermaids in the Moonlight, but I'll have to go and I didn't keep it next to me, which was a bit silly of me. But yeah, there is, there are images from the book online, which I hope will entice you to pick it up. And I do want to say this: Incantations over Water is strictly for adults. Please do not share it with your kids. But Mermaids in the Moonlight is for all ages, and I really hope that you will enjoy it, whether or not you are a kid or have a kid.
And we really don't mind if you have to run to the other room and grab it and show it to us. I really don't mind that.
But all right, so I'm going to stop video and I'll be right back. And please don't.
No, we won't. Come on, we wouldn't do that. Devapriya, what were you going to say?
Aarti actually has a copy of your book and is
she showing it? Oh, she's showing it. Oh, wait. She's gone. Oops. Oh, well, thank you, Aarti. We didn't even notice you. Thank you, though.
It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book.
You want to very quickly tell us your social media handles and all this?
Yes, I'm a little bit reluctant on social media, but I'm there on Instagram. I'm back. I'm just back. I took a social media break, but now I'm back and I'm on Twitter. And and I'd be happy to share some pictures on Instagram later today. There's also, I think, the first chapter is there on scroll of Indira, the first graphic chapter. So Sharanya is here.
Yeah, see, it didn't take long at all. Please go ahead. Your
Look
fans
how
already had
tiny it is. I was like a child when I saw this because it's got silver foil.
It's definitely worth it. We're so glad you brought it.
So yes, it's got a lovely shiny cover. And I would like to show you the particular image I was talking about bringing gravity through the illustration. This triptych panel has got, on one side it's got destruction to property, in the middle it's got a child soldier, and the final image here is a tribute to the Mothers of the Disappeared movement, which you can read about. And they have been having ongoing protests for years, trying to find out what happened to their loved ones who disappeared at the end of the Civil War. And the text only says this. It says, "There's a lot of sorrow in this place," Amma whispered to me. "Sometimes you just have to pause and feel it." So the illustrations say much, much more than the words themselves. And yeah, and I'll just show you some mermaids, because who doesn't like mermaids? So,
and it's such a different style as well. Very,
mermaids from around the world.
yes.
Yeah. And this is my favorite page.
Really beautiful, also very harmonious in a certain way.
Thank you so much. The art for the graphic novel is a little different, different color palette. Yeah.
Do you ever would you like to someday like perform as not perform, but I mean like do exhibits as an artist, or like do more work in that field? Because it's really beautiful what you're doing, and I'm sure that there'd be a lot of spaces interested in it.
Thank you. I'd love to. I would love to. These books were digitally illustrated, and I taught myself digital illustration just by buying the software and the hardware last year. But I had been painting for many years before that, so it was a very intuitive thing to pick up. And digital illustration makes life much, much, much easier in a lot of ways. So I definitely recommend, if people are thinking of making that switch, try it out. I used relatively inexpensive hardware and software. I used a brand called Huion, which I think is China made, and a software called Clip Studio Paint. So you do not have to invest in Apple products, which can be very expensive. So yeah, this book is proof that you can make art without having to really go out and splurge.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and anyways, I think I'm going to have to ask you something else privately, because I suddenly got a really interesting idea, because I'm also connected with a lot of local painters who are from this land as well. So anyways, I'll send you another email later. But for now, I have to do one more thing for the Chakkar. If any of you have, I'm sure some of you have, I'm really happy to have seen a lot of you here. If you enjoyed this presentation and learning about these authors, please put your email in the chat box, because we would like to collect it for the Chakkar mailing list, so that when we have our next events or when we have other things, we can kind of make sure that you receive notice of that. So please, if you're interested and you consent to having us mail you and spam you on our mailing list, please go ahead and put your email at the bottom. Otherwise, do you have any last minute questions or thoughts? Well, wonderful. I really enjoyed getting to know you all. I feel like, as I said with Varud and Sharanya, I feel like we have to have a parallel discussion of something else later. But I really also enjoyed getting to know Devapriya as well. And it's also interesting the work you're doing. I'm looking forward.
Thank you, Kiran.
Yes. No, sorry. Just like, it was interesting because I didn't realize that we'd incidentally like have, normally with the Chakkar, we have like more of like a very like Indian oriented art thing. But today we also had like a little bit of like the diaspora speak. So I really enjoyed having this fusion of like perspectives. So, but yes, all perspectives. And it's also really, I wanted to ask you a lot more questions as well about that part of your like project where you were maybe also like using social media and the elements of kind of, I mean, the Heat and Dust project, of how social media and travel were also part of your formation of your book, but we've run out of time and it might have to be a private conversation because it didn't fit well with, it didn't harmoniously fit into the other topics. So I had to, anyways, but yes, thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thanks for having us. It was great to be speaking with the three of you. Honestly, inspirational people here. So thank you very much.
Yes, equally, likewise. We all, I mean, I really thought this was a wonderful conversation. I'm looking forward to the future ones. It'll come after it.
Thank you
Absolutely.
so much. It was absolutely a pleasure. I really, really enjoyed this and really loved being on this panel with my co-panelists. You know, I admire both your works so much, and I've loved getting to know you as well, and we will chat.
Definitely, definitely. Some make more sense for different contexts. That's the main thing. But yes, thank you for coming, everyone. And regardless, you're always welcome back to speak and enjoy with, you know, anyone else who happens to be presenting with the Golchakkar. All right, wonderful. Well, everyone have a wonderful day. It is also Pride Month, so if any of you are celebrating, I send my regards to you as well. So take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.